I will never forget the sound of laughter that night, sharp and polished, rolling off crystal glasses at the country club. Mark had his hand on Tessa's arm as he leaned close, whispering something that made her tilt her head back in delight. I stood near the edge of the room, smile frozen in place, pretending to admire the flower arrangements, when all I could hear was that laugh. It wasn't just friendly, there was something layered beneath it, a private language I hadn't been invited to learn. In that instant, with music swelling and cameras flashing, I felt the first tremor of a fault line that would soon shatter the life I thought I knew. Before I continue, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true family stories about love, betrayal, and quiet justice. My name is Elena Brooks. I've spent the last 20 years working as a high school counselor in our small Midwestern town. I believed in building a steady life, one where children grew up safe and marriages deepened with time. Mark, my husband, worked as a regional sales director. His job kept him on the road, but he always promised it was for us. For the house we loved, for the college fund, for the future we had planned. We married young, raised our daughter Lily with a mix of laughter and discipline, and from the outside, people told us we were the picture of balance. When I was younger, I imagined marriage as a quilt stitched together by years of shared meals and small compromises. For a long time, I thought that was true for us. Mark brought home roses after long trips, and I kept the house running when he was gone. Our friends often said we had it figured out, that we balanced one another, his charisma and my patience. For a while, I believed it too. We attended school concerts, Sunday cookouts, and family gatherings, the rhythm of life so steady I almost mistook it for security. But looking back, I realized that cracks don't announce themselves with fanfare. They start quietly in the late-night phone that goes unanswered, in the business trips that stretch a little longer each year, in the way his eyes would linger too long on a friend's smile. At first, I brushed it aside. After all, Mark was charming, and charm often strayed without malice. But charm, when mixed with secrecy, begins to sour into something else. Tessa had been my friend since our daughters were in elementary school together. She was bold, full of energy, and knew everyone worth knowing. When she offered to help plan my father-in-law Walter's retirement party, I thought it was generous. I didn't realize then that generosity can sometimes disguise ambition. Walter, a proud man who built his life with calloused hands as a contractor, adored Mark. He often said his son inherited his determination, though I sometimes wondered if what Mark truly inherited was Walter's stubbornness without his loyalty. The night of the country club gala was supposed to be about Walter, his years of work, his quiet sacrifice, his transition into the slower pace of retirement. But as I watched Tessa lean close to my husband, her manicured fingers brushing his sleeve, it became clear that the spotlight was drifting. Mark looked younger in that glow, more alive than he had in years, while I stood unnoticed at the edge. I told myself it was nothing that old friends can laugh and touch without meaning more. Yet a cold weight settled in my chest that I couldn't shake. When the evening ended, Mark draped his arm casually around my shoulders as if nothing had shifted. He drove us home through quiet streets while I stared out the window, the lamplight blurring into streaks. He hummed softly to the radio content in his own world, while I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from asking questions. Sometimes silence is not peace, it is survival. A fragile thread holding together what you're not ready to see unravel. That night, as I stood in the kitchen rinsing wine glasses, I thought of the way Tessa's laughter echoed louder than my own voice had in years. It was then I realized something dangerous. Betrayals often begin long before they're spoken aloud. And mine had already started. The days after Walter's retirement gala should have been filled with warm stories and family pride. Yet something in me felt unsettled. I couldn't erase the image of Tessa leaning close to Mark, her laughter cutting through the music like a bell meant only for him. I tried to brush it aside, telling myself I was tired from the party and too much wine, but the memory returned at odd moments. Folding laundry, sitting at my desk, stirring soup on the stove, I would suddenly hear her laughter in my head, light and unguarded, as though I had stumbled into a private room. A week later, we gathered at Walter's home to help sort through his tools and paperwork. The old contractor's garage was lined with heavy wooden shelves, every pegboard hook holding some relic of his trade. Walter insisted on showing Mark which wrenches were worth keeping and which he should donate. Joanne hovered nearby, reminding him to pace himself, though Walter ignored her fussing with the stubborn pride of a man who had spent his life building with his hands. Lily wandered in and out, pretending to help while really texting her friends. I moved between rooms, keeping coffee cups filled and trying to avoid the heaviness sitting in my chest. At one point, I stepped out onto the porch to catch a breath of air. The autumn sky was low and gray, the kind of day where wind carries the smell of rain before a drop falls. Through the thin walls of the house, I heard voices, Mark's low tone, and Tessa's quicker cadence. They were standing in the kitchen, going over something with a kind of intensity that didn't fit casual conversation. I lingered outside, listening without meaning to. "We'll figure it out before the holidays," Mark said firmly. "And she won't suspect a thing," Tessa replied, her voice dropping almost conspiratorial. My hand tightened around the mug I was holding. I stepped back in the screen door, creaking. Their heads snapped toward me in perfect unison. Tessa's smile appeared first too bright, too quick. "Oh, Elena, we were just talking about the centerpiece colors for Thanksgiving. I thought maybe a deep burgundy would tie in with the season." Mark's eyes flicked to me, and then away, his shoulders stiff. I forced a nod, pretending I believed them, though my pulse thudded in my ears. That evening when we drove home, I asked Mark directly, "Why were you and Tessa whispering in the kitchen?" He kept his gaze on the road. "We weren't whispering. We were talking about your father's party. She helped plan it. Remember?" The words were clipped, rehearsed. I let them pass without challenge, but inside, I knew I'd heard something more than small talk. The weeks that followed only deepened the unease. Tessa's name began to appear everywhere in group texts about holiday plans and casual mentions from Mark in Lily's stories about rides home from school. Tessa had offered to help with Lily's senior banquet committee, something I had always assumed would be my role. I smiled when Lily told me, though I felt replaced in a way I couldn't explain. One afternoon, I arrived early to pick Lily up from practice. The parking lot was nearly empty, and as I pulled into a space, I saw Mark's car parked near the far corner. He wasn't inside, though. Through the windshield, I caught sight of him leaning against the hood, phone pressed to his ear, smiling at whatever was being said on the other end. A moment later, Tessa's car rolled in beside him. She stepped out, phone in hand too, and they exchanged a look that lingered too long before she laughed and touched his arm. I felt my throat tighten as I sat motionless behind the wheel, praying Lily wouldn't notice them when she walked out. That night, when I asked why he had been at the school, Mark said he'd been waiting for me so we could ride home together. He said it casually, as though the sight of Tessa pulling up hadn't meant anything. I didn't argue, but I felt something in me fold quietly inward. The man who once told me every detail of his day was now leaving out entire chapters. It wasn't just the secrecy. It was the dismissiveness. When I asked small questions, Mark would sigh heavily, as though I were being unreasonable. If I suggested a family outing, he would say he was tired from work. Then I'd later see photos on Tessa's social media of her at new restaurants in town. Restaurants Mark had mentioned in passing days earlier. The overlap was too precise to be coincidence. Joanne noticed too, though she approached it differently. One Sunday afternoon, while the men were in the garage and Lily was doing homework, she leaned across the kitchen table. Her hands, still elegant despite the years, clasped around her mug. "You should watch carefully, Elena," she murmured. "Tessa has always liked what belongs to other women." The words chilled me, not because they were cruel, but because they echoed the doubt already sitting heavy in my chest. As Thanksgiving drew closer, the house grew colder in ways that had nothing to do with the season. Mark was quick to anger, quicker to silence. He started spending more evenings at the office, though I'd long known most of his work could be handled from home. When he did sit at the dinner table, he seemed restless, checking his phone, often barely looking at me or Lily. The distance was no longer subtle. It was a chasm widening each day. I wanted to believe it was stress. I wanted to believe it was midlife weariness. But the truth was etched in every sideways glance, every missed call, every too bright laugh that slipped from Tessa's lips when she stood a little too close. What I had once thought of as a stable marriage was shifting under my feet, and I could no longer pretend the ground was firm. By the time Thanksgiving arrived, I knew that whatever secrets they were guarding would not stay hidden much longer. The table was set, the candles lit, and the family gathered, but beneath the clinking of silverware and polite conversation, tension hummed like an unspoken threat. I could feel it pressing against the walls of our home, waiting to break loose. The Thanksgiving table looked beautiful that year. Linen napkins folded just right, Walter's favorite pecan pie cooling on the sideboard, and a fire crackling in the hearth. Family gathered around, voices rising and falling in polite conversation. Yet beneath the warmth, there was an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. Mark sat at the far end beside Tessa, their chairs angled slightly toward each other, shoulders brushing whenever one leaned in to speak. From where I sat, their laughter floated above the clinking of silverware, private and constant, like a current that excluded the rest of us. I tried to keep my focus on Lily. She had dressed carefully, a soft blue dress that made her look older than her 17 years, and she was chattering about college applications to Joanne. But even as I smiled at my daughter's enthusiasm, my eyes drifted back down the table. Tessa touched Mark's sleeve when she reached for the gravy boat, and he didn't pull away. Instead, he looked at her as if she had said something only he could understand. When the meal ended, the men drifted toward the living room to watch football, while the women gathered in the kitchen. Joanne rinsed dishes at the sink, her movements brisk, while I stacked plates. Tessa leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone, offering little in the way of help. After a moment, Joanne gave me a look that was sharper than her usual polite glances. "You should keep your eyes open, Elena," she murmured. "Some people thrive on stepping into places they don't belong." The words hung in the air like smoke, and though Tessa pretended not to hear, I saw her jaw tighten. That night, when we returned home, the silence in the car felt heavier than usual. Lily fell asleep in the back seat, her head against the window, and I sat stiffly beside Mark as he drove. I wanted to ask him why he had chosen to sit with Tessa, why he laughed at her jokes while ignoring mine, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I pressed my hands together in my lap and listened to the steady rhythm of the tires on the road. In the weeks that followed, I felt the shift growing sharper. Mark spent more nights away, claiming late meetings or regional calls. When he was home, he carried his phone everywhere, answering texts with a quick smile before tucking it out of sight. Once when I asked who he was talking to, he replied too quickly, "Just a colleague," and walked into another room. The old habit of sharing details had vanished. Our conversations grew thin like fabric worn down from years of use. December arrived with its string of obligations. School concerts, Walter's birthday holiday gatherings, each one placing us together in rooms where Tessa was always present. At Walter's birthday dinner, she brought a gift wrapped in gold paper and placed it directly into Mark's hands, ignoring me entirely. He thanked her with a smile that lasted a fraction too long, while I stood at his side, holding my own small gift for his father. I felt invisible, as though I had been quietly erased from my own family's story. Even Lily began to notice. One evening, as we decorated the tree, she glanced at me cautiously. "Mom," she said softly, "why is Dad always with Mrs. Grant lately?" My hands trembled as I adjusted an ornament. "They've been helping with family events." I said, my voice steady, though my heart was not. She nodded, unconvinced, and turned back to the tree. Watching my daughter doubt what she had once trusted felt like the sharpest cut of all. By Christmas, the distance between Mark and me had become impossible to ignore. At our family gathering, he unwrapped a sweater from me with a polite nod, then later pulled a slim box from his pocket and handed it to Tessa. Inside was a bracelet, delicate and shining, clearly chosen with care. She gasped with delight, thanking him with a kiss on the cheek while the room filled with awkward silence. I kept my smile in place, but something inside me folded in on itself, bruised and raw. That night, after the house was quiet and Lily had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room. The lights from the tree glowed softly against the dark window, and I let the weight of everything settle over me. I thought about the laughter, the whispers, the gifts that weren't mine to give or receive. My chest ached with a quiet grief I couldn't voice not yet. For years, I had believed in the strength of our marriage, in the steady rhythm of partnership. Now I realized I had been holding together threads that were already unraveling. I cried silently, tears soaking into the sleeve of my sweater, careful not to wake anyone. The house was still, yet I felt as if every wall carried the echoes of my pain. Betrayal is rarely a single moment. It seeps in slowly, unnoticed, until it surrounds you completely. I had spent months brushing off small signs, convincing myself I was overthinking. But now, sitting alone in the glow of the tree, I could no longer deny it. Mark's absence wasn't just physical. It was emotional, complete, deliberate. And though I had not yet spoken the words aloud, I knew the truth had already begun its quiet march into the open. What hurt most was not only the betrayal itself, but the way it hollowed out the life we had built. As the new year began, I told myself I would find strength. Yet each time I looked at Mark, I saw only distance. Each time Tessa entered a room, I felt my heart tighten. The silent suffering became my daily companion, unseen by most, carried quietly as I moved through work, through family dinners, through every ordinary moment. And still, somewhere beneath the sorrow, a faint thread of resolve began to stir. I didn't know yet how or when, but I understood one thing clearly: the truth would not stay hidden forever. January brought bitter cold, the kind that seemed to slip through window panes no matter how high the thermostat was turned. I bundled myself in sweaters and scarves, but nothing seemed to warm the distance that had grown inside my home. Mark came and went with a rhythm I no longer recognized, and when he was there, his presence felt more like absence. He would sit at the table with his phone face down, as though pretending to be attentive, but the tension in his shoulders told me where his thoughts drifted. I tried to bury myself in work at the high school. Counseling students about their own futures was strangely grounding when my own marriage felt so uncertain. I listened to seniors worry about college, about leaving home, about losing the stability they had always known. I offered them reassurance with a calm voice, though inside, I envied their belief that life could still be shaped by simple choices. At home, I no longer felt the power to steer anything. One evening, after a long day, I returned to find Lily setting the table for just the two of us. Dad texted, she said, avoiding my eyes. He's having dinner with clients. She tried to sound casual, but I caught the quick frown before she looked away. We ate quietly, the clatter of forks on plates too loud in the silence. Halfway through the meal, she asked, "Mom, are you and Dad okay?" Her voice was soft, uncertain. My chest tightened, and I forced a small smile. "We're fine, sweetheart. Just busy." It was a lie, but I wasn't ready to hand her the weight I was carrying. A few nights later, I finally let the truth press its way forward. Mark came home late, the smell of perfume clinging faintly to his coat. It wasn't mine, and the sweetness of it made my stomach turn. I waited until Lily was asleep before asking, "Where were you, Mark?" He set down his keys without looking at me. "I told you, meetings." I took a breath. "Then why do you smell like perfume?" His head jerked up, eyes narrowing. "Are you seriously accusing me right now?" His voice rose sharp with indignation. I swallowed the lump in my throat and whispered, "I just need you to be honest." He grabbed his coat and stormed out the door, slamming so hard it rattled the frame. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I thought of the years we had built together, of the family dinners, the vacations, the quiet mornings when love felt simple. Now every memory felt fragile, like glass threatening to shatter. My tears came slowly soaking the pillow, and I cried in silence, unwilling to let Lily hear. The following week, Joanne called me in a rare moment of candor. Her voice was low, almost hesitant. "Elena, I don't want to meddle, but I've noticed things between Mark and Tessa." I gripped the phone tighter, my heart pounding. "What things?" She paused. "The way he looks at her. The time they spend together. I may be wrong, but I thought you should know you're not imagining it." When we hung up, I sat at the kitchen table with my head in my hands, the confirmation both a relief and a fresh wound. In February, the truth became harder to ignore. Tessa's social media bloomed with photographs from dinners, from gatherings where Mark always seemed to appear at her side. He wasn't tagged directly, but I saw his reflection in the background, his arm resting on her chair, his watch glinting under the restaurant lights. Each photo was a whisper I couldn't silence. I saved them quietly on my phone, not to show anyone yet, but because I knew evidence mattered more than suspicion. One Saturday afternoon, I drove past the cafe downtown on my way to the grocery store. Through the window, I saw them, Mark leaning across the table, Tessa's hand resting lightly on his. They were laughing, heads bent close, as though sharing a secret the world couldn't touch. My breath caught, and I pulled over a block away, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles whitened. I didn't go inside. I didn't want a scene. Instead, I sat there until they stood and walked out together, his hand brushing the small of her back. The sight was worse than any argument we could have had. When he returned home that night, he acted as though nothing had happened. He kissed my cheek distractedly, asked if there was dinner, and settled in front of the television. I watched him from the kitchen doorway, my chest hollow. I wanted to scream to demand the truth, but instead, I stayed silent. It wasn't fear that held me back, it was clarity. I realized then that shouting would only give him more power. My silence became my armor. Each day that followed, I carried the weight quietly. At school, I smiled at colleagues' guided students and kept moving as though nothing was wrong. At home, I cooked, cleaned, and kept the rhythms of family life intact. Inside, though, I was breaking in places no one could see. In the shower, I cried where the water could hide it. In the car, I gripped the steering wheel too tightly, releasing sobs into the empty air before walking calmly into the house. Yet beneath the sorrow, something steadier began to form. I thought of Walter, of the decades he had worked with his hands, never backing down when something cracked or splintered. I thought of Lily, of the daughter who watched me closely, who needed to see strength even when it felt impossible. And I thought of myself, of the woman who had built a career, a home, a life. That woman wasn't weak, even if she was wounded. By the time spring neared, I understood I couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The laughter, the photographs, the whispers, they were no longer shadows of doubt. They were proof of a betrayal I could no longer excuse. My tears still came at night, but alongside them was a quiet resolve. I didn't know exactly what I would do, but I knew this: I would not let myself disappear in the shadow of their lies. Something inside me had shifted, and though my heart was heavy, my vision had grown clear. The days of pretending were ending, and soon so would the illusion Mark and Tessa thought they had so carefully built. The first real step I took wasn't loud or dramatic. It began one quiet afternoon in March, while the house was empty and I finally had space to think without glancing over my shoulder. I pulled out an old notebook and began to list every sign, every photo, every detail I had collected over the past months. Writing it down steadied me. The pain didn't lessen, but it transformed into something sharper, something closer to clarity. I didn't plan to confront Mark yet. Instead, I decided to prepare myself. If he wanted to keep me in the dark, I would learn how to see without him knowing. I reached out to a former colleague, Harold Kim, who now chaired the local education fund. We had worked together on scholarships years before, and he had always respected my steady approach. Over coffee, I explained that I was quietly reviewing our household finances and asked if he could recommend a trustworthy attorney for guidance. He studied me for a long moment, then gave me a name. "Whatever you're facing," he said softly, "remember you deserve to protect what's yours." I carried his words with me when I called the attorney's office the following week. The woman who answered spoke gently, setting an appointment for the following Thursday. I didn't tell Mark where I was going that day. I told him I had extra sessions at school, and he nodded distractedly, already scrolling through his phone. When I sat across from the attorney in her office, the air smelled faintly of paper and ink, and for the first time in months, I felt grounded. I explained my situation carefully, avoiding the mess of emotions, focusing instead on facts: my income, the house deed, our accounts, and what I had begun to suspect. She listened without interruption, then leaned forward. "Elena, you're wise to come now before anything escalates. Protecting your assets isn't about revenge. It's about dignity. If your marriage continues to unravel, you won't be left powerless." Her calm certainty steadied me. She suggested steps I could take quietly: organizing documents, updating beneficiaries, monitoring accounts. I left her office with a folder tucked under my arm, the weight of it strangely comforting. That evening, Mark came home late again. He kissed my cheek as if nothing were wrong and talked about a new client dinner. I nodded, serving dinner, but inside, I felt a shift. For months, I had been on the defensive, drowning in suspicion and sorrow. Now, for the first time, I felt like I had taken back a measure of control. Over the next few weeks, I moved carefully. I sorted old papers in the study, sliding key documents into a locked drawer. I checked statements and made quiet notes. Whenever Mark grew short-tempered or dismissive, I bit back the urge to lash out. Instead, I smiled, kept the peace, and reminded myself that silence could be stronger than accusation. Lily noticed the change in me. One afternoon, she came into the kitchen while I was making tea. "You seem different, Mom." "Calmer, I guess." I handed her a mug of cocoa and kissed the top of her head. "Sometimes calm is the best shield," I murmured. She didn't ask more, and I was grateful. The hardest part was enduring Tessa's presence. She seemed bolder as spring wore on, more certain of her place in gatherings. At Walter's house one Sunday, she breezed in carrying a casserole as if she belonged. Mark lit up when she arrived, his smile brighter than I had seen in months. I stayed composed, chatting with Joanne about garden plans even as my stomach twisted. But later, when I returned home and closed the bedroom door, I wrote down every detail in my notebook, each moment another stitch in the fabric of truth I was quietly weaving. By April, the weight of secrecy no longer crushed me. Instead, it steadied me. I no longer cried into my pillow at night. I watched, I listened, and I planned. If Mark believed he was winning by keeping me in the shadows, he was wrong. Each quiet step I took drew me closer to the moment when his lies would unravel under their own weight. I didn't know yet how the breaking point would arrive, but I could feel it moving closer like thunder, rolling in the distance before a storm. And when it came, I promised myself I would be ready. The breaking point came on a warm evening in late April. Lily had gone to a friend's house to study, and I was alone in the kitchen preparing dinner. I heard the front door open and close, then the low hum of Mark's voice. He wasn't alone. Tessa's laugh followed, light and careless, echoing down the hallway as if she owned the space. My hands froze on the cutting board. For months, suspicion had lived in shadows, but now the betrayal had walked into my home. They entered the dining room, their words hushed, unaware that I stood just around the corner. Mark's voice carried first. "She doesn't suspect how deep we're in. By summer, things will be different." Tessa sighed. "It would be easier if she'd just give up the house. We could start fresh." I stepped into the doorway before either of them realized I was listening. The knife still in my hand, the scent of onions clinging to my fingers. I looked straight at them. "Start fresh where exactly?" My voice was calm, steady, though my heart pounded. Tessa's face drained of color, and she reached for her purse as though to shield herself. Mark froze, mouth opening, then shutting again, like he had lost the ability to form words. Finally, he muttered, "Elena, you're misunderstanding." I set the knife gently on the counter and wiped my hands on a towel. "No, I think I understand perfectly. You've brought her into my home, into our life, and you think I'm blind." Tessa shifted uneasily, eyes darting toward the door. "Maybe I should go," she murmured. I tilted my head. "No, stay. You've already made yourself comfortable." Mark tried to recover his tone, sharp now. "This is why I didn't want to say anything. You twist everything into an attack. Tessa is just a friend." I laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. Friends don't sit whispering about houses and futures when a wife is in the next room. His jaw tightened, but he had no answer. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Tessa finally gathered her things and hurried out without another word. The door slammed behind her, and the house settled into a heavy quiet. Mark turned on me, then anger sparking in his eyes. "You've just ruined everything," he snapped. I met his gaze evenly. "No, Mark. You did that yourself." That night, he slept in the guest room. I lay awake in our bed, staring at the ceiling, the confrontation replaying in my mind. The pain was sharp, but beneath it, there was a strange calm. The truth had finally stepped into the open, and with it, the last veil of doubt had lifted. The next morning, he tried to return to normal. He poured coffee, asked about my schedule, spoke as though the night before had never happened. I answered politely, but with distance, watching him closely. For the first time, I saw him not as my husband, but as a man who had underestimated me. He believed he could still control the story, that I would retreat into silence. He was wrong. I began to move differently after that day. At school, I kept my focus on the students, but in the quiet moments between meetings, I organized documents, made copies, and built a careful record. At home, I observed storing away every careless comment, every unexplained absence, every inconsistency. Mark grew bolder, mistaking my calm for surrender. but each time he left for another client dinner, I added to my quiet archive. Walter called one afternoon, his voice gruff but concerned. "Elena, is everything all right between you two? I've noticed tension." I hesitated, then replied carefully. "Some things have come to light. I'm handling it." There was a pause on the line before he said, "You're stronger than he realizes." His words gave me more comfort than he probably knew. Joanne, too, seemed to sense the shift. At the next family gathering, she pulled me aside. "You look different," she whispered. "Not broken, resolved." I met her eyes and simply nodded. She didn't ask more, and I didn't offer. Mark and Tessa, however, underestimated me still. They began to appear together in more public ways, arriving at community events side by side, speaking in low tones at the edge of rooms. Whispers followed, though no one dared address it openly. I attended the same events holding my head high, offering polite smiles, and letting the silence work in my favor. People noticed more in silence than they ever did in protest. By May, Mark's frustration began to show. He accused me of being cold, of shutting him out, of making him the victim. Each accusation slid off me like water on stone. I no longer reacted, and that unnerved him more than anger ever could. He wanted a fight. I gave him stillness. He wanted me to crumble. I grew steadier. The night came when he finally shouted, his voice echoing through the house. "You think you're so clever, Elena, but you'll regret this. No one will believe you." I looked at him calm as I set down the dish I was holding. "I don't need to convince anyone, Mark. You're doing that yourself." He stormed out, slamming the door, and I sat in the quiet that followed the weight of his threats lingering in the air. Yet instead of fear, I felt a steady resolve. The storm he had tried to unleash was already unraveling around him, and he didn't even see it. I knew then that the moment was approaching, the moment when the truth would no longer be confined to my kitchen or whispered in the dark. It would be seen, undeniable, and unmerciful. And when that day arrived, there would be no going back. The storm broke at Walter's retirement gala, though none of them saw it coming. The banquet hall gleamed with polished wood floors and tall windows, every table draped in white linens and lined with flowers. Guests laughed and raised glasses honoring Walter for his decades of work. But beneath the surface, currents pulled in different directions. Mark stood near the stage, smiling for photos, while Tessa floated through the room as if she were already the hostess. I moved quietly among the guests, calm, steady, and prepared. By then, I had everything I needed. With Rebecca Hall's guidance, I had secured our assets, filed documents discreetly, and ensured that Lily and I were protected no matter what storm followed. I had also chosen this night for a reason. Family, friends, and community leaders filled the hall, including Harold Kim, who had offered steady support behind the scenes. If the truth was going to surface, it would not be whispered in corners anymore. It would be undeniable. The moment came when Walter raised his glass to thank everyone. Mark stepped forward, arm sliding around Tessa's waist, his hand lingering in a way that left little doubt about what had grown between them. The murmur in the room was subtle but unmistakable. I let the silence settle before stepping up to the microphone. My voice was clear, even carrying across the hall. "Before we go on, there's something I need to say." Every eye turned toward me. Mark's smile faltered, and Tessa stiffened beside him. I held the microphone steady. For months, I've watched as loyalty in this family has been traded for whispers and shadows. I stayed silent while my husband and my so-called friend wove lies in the dark. Tonight, I choose silence no more. Gasps rippled through the room. Mark tried to laugh it off, muttering, "Elena, not now," but I pressed on. From my folder, I pulled photographs, images of them at dinners, meetings, stolen moments captured by their own carelessness. I held them up, my hand steady. This is the truth they've tried to hide. Not just betrayal of vows, but betrayal of trust, family, and dignity. Tessa's face flushed crimson. She stammered, "This is inappropriate," but her words dissolved under the weight of the murmurs spreading through the hall. Joanne rose from her seat, her sharp voice cutting through the noise. "I told you both this would come to light." Walter sat in stunned silence, his weathered hands clenched around his glass. Mark lunged toward me, hissing under his breath. "You'll regret this." I met his glare with calm resolve. "No, Mark. What I regret is believing you valued this family more than your ego." His rage sputtered in the open air, his composure unraveling as he realized the room was no longer his to control. The gala ended in chaos. Guests whispered in clusters, avoiding Mark and Tessa, who slipped out under the weight of their own disgrace. Walter placed a trembling hand on my shoulder before he left, his eyes full of quiet sorrow, but also respect. "You did what needed to be done," he said softly. At home that night, Mark exploded. He accused me of humiliating him, of destroying his reputation, of turning people against him. I listened in silence, my arms crossed until his words burned out. Then I spoke plainly. "You destroyed yourself. I simply refuse to cover for you." He stormed into the guest room, slamming the door. I stood in the quiet kitchen, the faint smell of wine and roses still clinging to my dress, and felt the air clear. The days that followed brought more fallout than I could have imagined. Tessa's clients began canceling events, unwilling to trust their reputations to someone caught in scandal. Mark's company pulled him from regional accounts, citing concerns about discretion. Messages trickled in from friends and acquaintances, some offering sympathy, others simply keeping their distance from the wreckage. Through it all, I kept my head high. I went to work, tended to Lily, and moved forward one step at a time. Joanne called often, her voice a mix of sharpness and support. "They thought you'd crumble," she said once. "Instead, you've shown them what strength looks like." I thanked her quietly, knowing she was right. Mark tried to bargain as his world narrowed. He offered half-hearted apologies, promises of change, even veiled threats about dragging me down with him. I answered each one with the same steady calm. "I'm not afraid of the truth." My silence was no longer a shield. It was the proof of my strength. By early summer, it was clear their schemes had collapsed. Tessa's business faltered, and Mark's career was in tatters. The very attention they had craved had turned against them. And I, the woman they had dismissed, stood steady in the ruins they had made. Yet even in their downfall, I knew there was one final step left, one that would close the circle completely. The papers were ready, the path clear, and my resolve unshakable. The time had come to reclaim not just my dignity, but my future. The final step was as quiet as it was decisive. With Rebecca Hall's guidance, I filed the papers that ended my marriage to Mark. No shouting, no last-minute bargains, just signatures, dates, and a final recognition of what had already been lost. When I placed my pen on the desk, I felt a wave of release I hadn't known I was holding. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was freedom, and freedom can be enough. Walter called after the news spread through the family. His voice carried the weariness of age, but also respect. "You did what was right," he said. Joanne later added, "Sometimes strength looks like walking away while they're still shouting." Those words settled into me like stones that steadied rather than weighed me down. For years, I had wondered if I could withstand the collapse of a life I thought unshakable. Now I knew I could. Mark tried once more to reach out, though the bravado was gone from his voice. His messages wavered between regret and resentment, but I answered none of them. Tessa faded even quicker. Without her clients and her carefully polished reputation, she slipped quietly out of view. The two of them had once believed their laughter at the edge of a room gave them power. Now that laughter was gone, and with it, the illusion they built. Lily and I adjusted slowly, learning the rhythms of a new life together. She was old enough to see through the cracks and wise enough not to press me for more than I could give. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching fireflies drift over the lawn, she said simply, "You seem lighter, Mom." I smiled because she was right. The burden of silence had been heavier than I realized, and now it was gone. I returned to my work with a new sense of steadiness. My students saw the same counselor they had always trusted, but inside, I carried something different. I had learned that dignity is not in avoiding pain, but in walking through it without letting it strip you of your worth. The betrayal had been sharp, but it had not defined me. What defined me was the choice to protect myself, my daughter, and the life we still had ahead. Looking back, I see now that the quiet steps were the most powerful ones. Not the confrontation in a crowded hall, not the whispers that preceded it, but the steady resolve to protect what was mine without lowering myself to their chaos. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply holds steady until the truth reveals itself. If there is one lesson I carry, it is this. You cannot control the choices of others, but you can decide what you will and will not accept. Betrayal may shake the ground beneath you, but it cannot erase your foundation if you stand firm. In the end, I did not win by breaking them. I won by refusing to let them break me. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.